The forbidden love between a queen and a slave that changed everything. Some stories aren't meant to be remembered. They're meant to be hidden, erased, buried beneath the stones of castles and the silence of those who survived. This is one of those stories. A love that should never have happened. A life created in defiance of kings and chains. A choice made not out of courage, but out of something even more dangerous. Hope. What if a queen dared to feel? What if a slave dared to look back? Before we begin, subscribe to this channel for more of the most unforgettable stories on YouTube. Tales that dig beneath the surface of history, where emotions leave scars deeper than swords, and the truth is too raw to be told in books. Now, let's take you into the heart of Valoria. Valoria was gold on the outside and wrought on the inside. A kingdom built on silk and steel, where crowns gleamed, but justice was blindfolded. Nobles feasted on silver, while farmers starved in silence. Every corner whispered of glory, yet the truth clung to the floor like dust, unseen, unwanted, swept away by servants whose names were never spoken. It was here, in this kingdom of illusion, that two lives existed without truly living. She was Queen Aurelia, or rather, she was the image of a queen, draped in satin, laced in jewels, adored by statues but not by people. Married off at 17 to a king who kissed like a politician and ruled like a storm. He didn't hit her, but power doesn't need to leave bruises to wound. He silenced her with protocol, drowned her in obligations, and locked her inside a palace so beautiful it hurt to look at. She had everything except the right to feel anything. She smiled for the court and wept for herself. She dined with ambassadors and choked on loneliness. Every word she spoke was rehearsed. Every glance measured. The world saw a throne. She lived inside a cage. And then there was Rowan. Rowan had no title, no past, and no last name. He belonged to the palace, but not to the people in it. He scrubbed floors with broken knuckles and bowed lower than the ground itself. His voice was never asked for, his eyes never noticed. He was born in a silence and raised in fear. His only skill was survival. He moved through corridors like a shadow, always there, never seen. Not even the guards remembered his face. He wasn't someone. He was something. A tool. A pair of hands that cleaned what the royals dirted. And yet, in the quiet corners of Valoria's heart, fate stirred. They were never meant to meet. Not really. A queen and a slave did not breathe the same air, let alone share the same silence. But chance, or maybe something deeper, carved a moment into their lives that neither could unlive. She was walking back from another hollow dinner, her smile stiff, her soul heavy, when he crossed the hall ahead of her. Their eyes met. Just once. 1 second. That's all it was. And that was all it took. He looked away, terrified, not out of disrespect, but out of instinct. A slave did not look at a queen, but she didn't look away. She looked harder. Not because he was beautiful, but because he was real. Real in a way that nothing in her life had been for years. Real like pain, like breath, like memory. Her body froze, her mind raced. She didn't know what she felt, only that she had felt something. And he felt everything. He didn't mean to look at her. He wasn't supposed to. No one in his position ever did. Not without permission, not without consequence. But the floor was wet, his body moved faster than thought, and when he glanced up, just for balance, his eyes met hers. It lasted less than a heartbeat. One breath, one blink. But something shifted in that small sliver of time, something neither of them could take back. Rowan froze like a man who had just stepped off a cliff. He lowered his gaze instantly, waiting for the punishment that would follow. But it didn't come, because she hadn't looked away. She'd kept staring, not in anger, not in confusion, but with something dangerously close to hunger. It wasn't desire, not yet. It was something older, something rawer, like thirst in a woman who hadn't tasted real water in years. From that day, the palace felt different, not in walls or corridors or protocols, but in the weight of silence when they were near each other. Aurelia began taking longer walks through the servants' quarters, her eyes searching for something she wouldn't admit she was looking for. Rowan started working faster, more efficiently, try to finish his tasks before she passed by, but somehow always failing. They didn't speak. They didn't touch. But their eyes met again and again and again. Each time a little longer. Each time a little braver. She dropped her handkerchief on the marble staircase one afternoon. He picked it up. Their fingers touched. It was nothing. A second. A gesture. But it was everything. The heat from that contact stayed with him for hours, burned through his skin and into his thoughts. That night, he didn't sleep. Neither did she. The palace staff began to notice the shift. Not with suspicion, but with whispers. The queen no longer smiled during dinners. She no longer snapped at her attendants. She sat in silence, chewing slowly, eyes glazed as if remembering something that hadn't yet happened. Rowan avoided her, as much as his duties allowed. But she kept appearing. In corridors, on balconies, near stairwells where he worked. She didn't speak to him, but her presence was louder than any voice. He began to dread seeing her, and dread not seeing her even more. It was a slow kind of torment. Sweet, dangerous. One day, as he scrubbed the courtyard floor, he felt her eyes on him before he turned. She stood at the edge of the balcony, watching. She wasn't smiling. Her expression was blank, but her gaze held him still, like a hand around his throat. He wanted to run. He wanted to kneel. He wanted to disappear. But he just stood there, caught in the invisible thread tying them together. For the first time, he thought, this is not a game. This is not safe. And she thought, I don't care. That night, she dreamed of him. In the dream, he wasn't a servant. He was dressed in simple white, standing beneath the stars, arms outstretched. She walked to him. She touched his chest. And there was nothing between them. No king. No crown. No eyes watching. When she woke, she was sweating. Her mouth dry. Her body trembling with something she didn't have words for. And she whispered his name, not out loud, not yet, but inside her chest where it beat like a secret. The next morning, she said his name aloud for the first time. Rowan. He was walking past the colonnade, carrying buckets. He stopped dead. No one called him by name, not even other servants. He turned slowly, afraid it had been a mistake. But she was there, standing with her maids behind her, her face unreadable. Their eyes locked. And again, everything inside him burned. His name on her lips didn't sound like a command. It sounded like freedom. He bowed. She didn't say another word. But the damage was done. Something had begun. Something neither of them could stop now. From that day forward, nothing could return to the way it was. The small touches became intentional. The handkerchief no longer needed to fall. It was placed. The glances became stares. The silences became louder than conversations. And every time they crossed paths, the space between them grew thinner, like the air itself was waiting for them to act on what they both knew was happening. Rowan's hand shook when he was alone. Aurelia's nights were sleepless. She began writing letters she never sent, folding them into tiny squares and hiding them beneath her pillow. Words like, why do I feel like I'm alive only when I see you? Words like, what is worse, living in silence or dying for love? She began dismissing her guards earlier, extending her evening walks. Every moment not spent near him felt wasted. And yet, she never touched him. Not yet, because even desire has rules. Even rebellion starts in shadows. But inside both of them, something wild had already taken root. It wasn't lust, though lust had its place. It wasn't just rebellion. It was something neither of them had been given before. Choice. To choose to look, to choose to feel, and most dangerously, to choose to want what was forbidden. Not out of revenge, not out of delusion, but out of something neither crown nor chain could dictate. Longing. They didn't speak about what was happening. Not in words. Words would have made it real. And making it real would mean acknowledging the danger, the punishment, the cost. So instead, they kept moving through the palace like ghosts who had seen each other's reflections. Each encounter left them more exposed. And yet, they didn't stop. Because they couldn't. Because something had been set in motion. A slow fire. A whisper growing louder. A hunger that would no longer stay silent. It began with notes, small, folded pieces of parchment slipped between linens or tucked behind stone cracks in the corridor walls. Words never signed, yet unmistakably theirs. I saw you today, one read, and forgot how to breathe. Another, your silence is the loudest part of my day. At first, it was innocent, a way to survive the storm building inside them. But soon, the words grew heavier, riskier. Do you dream of me the way I dream of you? If I were not queen, and you not servant, would we still pretend? The lines between safety and surrender blurred, and still they wrote. It was the only place they could speak the truth. Their meeting started by accident, or so they told themselves. He would sweep a hallway longer than needed. She would walk the garden path later than usual. But eventually, hiding wasn't enough. They began to choose the dark. A stairwell beneath the West Tower. A storage room that hadn't been used since the coronation. Places no one bothered to look. Places where eyes couldn't follow. Where they didn't have to pretend. They never stayed long. Minutes at most. A glance. A whisper. A touch that barely qualified as contact. But in those moments time bent. Her fingers grazing his wrist felt like lightning. His breath close to her ear felt like prayer. Nothing had happened, yet everything already had. Rowan carried the weight like a stone tied to his chest. He walked faster, kept his head lower, scrubbed harder. Anything to outrun the fact that he was falling in love with someone he wasn't allowed to want. It wasn't just dangerous. It was suicide. One misplaced letter, one guard with sharp eyes, one wrong moment, and he'd hang before dawn. But the fear didn't stop him. It never does when you've already tasted something more powerful. He didn't love her because she was a queen. He loved her despite it. And maybe because she was the first person who ever looked at him and didn't see a servant. She saw a man. And that, to him, was more intoxicating than any kiss. Aurelia didn't have the luxury of fear. Not the kind Rowan did. Hers was colder, deeper, like a scream that could never leave her mouth. Every part of her life was controlled. Her food, her sleep, her thoughts. She had been trained since girlhood to obey, to rule, to submit. But no one had prepared her for this. For the ache of wanting something she couldn't command. Rowan was not a court game, not a political move. He was the first thing in her life that didn't ask permission to exist. And she needed that. Needed him. Even if it meant destroying everything that had kept her safe. She tried to stop. Told herself it would pass. That it was just infatuation, rebellion, loneliness disguised as longing. But her hands betrayed her. Her steps wandered without thinking. Her dreams brought him back again and again. One evening, she stood by the old armory, waiting. He was late. Her heart pounded like it was trying to warn her. Get out, turn back, this is madness. But when he finally appeared, dusty and breathless, all she said was, I thought you wouldn't come. He looked at her, his jaw tight. I shouldn't have. But he did. They didn't kiss that night. They didn't need to. Everything in the space between them said what their mouths could not. Her hand rested over his, fingers trembling. His forehead leaned into hers, eyes closed. And for that minute, they weren't queen and servant. They were just two people, tired, afraid, starving for connection in a place built to keep them hollow. But the moment ended, as all stolen moments must. A sound down the hallway. A torchlight flicker. They pulled apart. No bouvier. No words. Only the echo of what almost happened. In the days that followed, their letters turned more urgent. We cannot keep doing this, one read. And yet I will if you ask. Another, if this ends badly, remember, I was already half dead before you looked at me. They weren't reckless. Not yet. But they were no longer careful either. Love makes fools of everyone eventually. And theirs was growing louder by the second. The tension built slowly, like water rising in a locked room. They both knew it would break. The question was when, and who would drown first. She had been feeling it for weeks. The fatigue that wouldn't lift. The dizziness. The nausea that struck at sunrise and clung to her through midday like a curse. At first, Aurelia told herself it was stress, that the weight of their secret had simply begun pressing harder. But deep down, she already knew. There are some truths the body speaks before the mind dares to hear. It was the morning she collapsed beside the ivory wash basin that sealed it. The servant girl rushed to her side, calling for water, but Aurelia waved her off. Her hands trembled as she pressed them against her abdomen, as if trying to feel the future growing beneath her skin. Later that day, she summoned the palace healer under the pretense of needing a remedy for nerves. The woman checked her pulse, her tongue, her scent, then asked a single question. How long since your last bleeding? Silence answered for her. The woman didn't press further. She simply bowed her head and whispered, "You're with child, my queen." And just like that, the world cracked. Aurelia locked herself inside her chamber for the next 3 days. She didn't eat. She didn't speak. She stared at her reflection until she could no longer recognize the woman looking back. A queen, a wife, a traitor, a mother, all at once. The whispers in her mind came sharp and fast. How? Why? What now? The king hadn't touched her in over 4 months. The timeline couldn't be hidden. She tried to will it away, bargaining with her body like it was something separate from her, something she could command. But her body had never listened to her. Not when they forced her into marriage. Not when they crowned her with a voice she didn't choose. And not now. The decision to tell Rowan wasn't easy. It wasn't about trust. She trusted him more than anyone. It was about the weight she was about to hand him. The knowledge that his life, her life, their child's life, all hung on a thread that could be snapped by a single whisper in the wrong ear. When she finally sent word through their usual channel, it was just 4 words, come. Urgent. No delay. He arrived through the servant tunnels, face streaked with ash from the coal room, hands still smelling of iron. When he stepped into her private chamber, he could already tell something had broken. She stood near the window, arms crossed over her chest, back rigid. When she turned, her face was pale, but her eyes held no tears. Only fire. I'm pregnant, she said. No lead up. No soft landing. Just the truth, clean and brutal. Rowan didn't speak. His chest rose, then fell. Then again. His hands shook slightly as they dropped to his sides. How far? He asked. She looked down. Almost 2 months. He walked toward her, slow, careful, as if approaching a wild animal or a sacred thing. Are you sure? She nodded. Completely. He sat down hard on the edge of the bed. His mind ran through 100 things at once. What this meant, what could happen, how fast everything would unravel. But above all that noise, one thought rang clear. It's mine. He didn't ask. He didn't need to. He knew. And in knowing, he broke. Not from fear, but from love. The kind that arrives too late to run from, too early to hold on to. I did this, he whispered. No, she replied, walking toward him. We did. She knelt in front of him, took his hands, pressed them to her face. It wasn't a mistake, Rowan. It was the only real thing I've ever chosen. But truth doesn't erase danger. And that danger now had a deadline. 7 months, maybe less, before the signs became undeniable. The swell in her belly, the change in her skin. The whispers would start. The servants would talk. The king, he wouldn't ask questions. He'd order executions. Adultery among royals could be spun, dismissed. But a child with the wrong skin, the wrong blood? That would be war. Rowan couldn't breathe. They'll kill you, he said. They'll kill the baby. His voice cracked on the word baby. And they'll hang me from the gates before dawn. Aurelia squeezed his hand tighter. Unless we do something first. And just like that, the fear became clarity. They couldn't wait. They couldn't hide. The fantasy of stolen nights and hidden letters had come to an end. This wasn't about desire anymore. It was about survival. For both of them. For all 3 of them. Because love was no longer the risk. Now it was the reason. They had 7 months. Maybe less. Every hour brought them closer to exposure, and there was no room for hesitation anymore. Rowan knew it. Aurelia knew it. The child growing inside her would not carry the king's blood. And when that truth surfaced, no wall, no crown, no prayer would save them. So they stopped pretending. They stopped dreaming. And they started planning. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't thrilling. It was terrifying. Every step they took was a step away from survival as they knew it, but it was the only way forward. Marisol was the first and only person they told. She didn't gasp. She didn't scold. She didn't even blink. She'd been in the palace longer than anyone. She had wiped blood off marble floors, helped queens deliver stillborns in silence, held the hands of girls too young to be married off to men too old to walk. She had seen it all. So when Aurelia, pale and shaking, confessed, "I'm pregnant," "It's Rowan's," Marisol simply nodded and said, "Then we'll get you out." Her loyalty wasn't to the crown. It never had been. It was to the girl she had raised like a daughter, while the king was too busy waging wars and building statues in his own name. The first week was all about silence. Observation, mapping the guards' rotations, counting how many cooks came through the back halls, timing the bell tolls. Marisol knew every passage the builders had buried beneath stone and time. She led them through servant tunnels no longer used, through wine cellars no longer stocked, through cracks behind the chapel where no priest ever ventured. Rowan memorized every route. Aurelia practiced wearing a maid's gown until it felt like skin. They communicated in whispers, in glances, in the spaces between danger and hope. The second week, they gathered what they could. Coins hidden in the hems of dresses, dried bread and jerky stashed beneath floorboards, a change of clothes buried in the ashes of the old laundry room. Marisol secured a horse, black, strong, fast. A stable boy owed her a favor. He didn't ask questions. He wouldn't live long if he did. The hardest part wasn't the logistics. It was pretending everything was normal, attending banquets, smiling at nobles, kissing the king's hand while her body carried another man's child. Aurelia became two people, the queen who played her part and the woman who planned her escape. They chose the Festival of Masks. It was perfect. Every year, the entire kingdom descended into chaos. Music, fire, dancing in the streets, people dressed as beggars and kings alike. The palace would be overflowing with noise, wine, and distraction. The king would be drunk on his own reflection. And for once, eyes would not be watching the queen. They marked the date, midnight, when the final bell of the temple tower rang out across the courtyard. They would go. They rehearsed everything, where they would meet, what to do if one of them didn't show, how long to wait before leaving someone behind. Rowan insisted he'd never leave without her. Aurelia didn't argue, but she had already decided, if it came down to it, she'd let him go. He still had a chance at life. Her chances died the moment the pregnancy began. The night before the escape, they didn't sleep. They sat in silence in the hidden room beneath the old kitchen, their hands clasped, breathing in sync. There were no speeches, no promises, just the weight of what tomorrow meant. Marisol stood by the door, arms crossed, eyes harder than usual. "If you hesitate," she said, "you die. If you stop, you die. If you look back," she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. At sundown, the palace erupted in color. Torches were lit. Music played. Servants laughed louder than they ever dared. Everyone wore masks, some elegant, some grotesque. It was tradition. It was cover. Aurelia wore a simple brown cloak, her hair braided and hidden beneath a scarf. Rowan wore a baker's apron. Marisol, as always, blended in without effort. They slipped through the outer kitchens, past the rear stables, down into the wine cellars, then up again into the narrow servant corridor leading to the bodega gate. They moved like ghosts. But even ghosts can be seen when the wrong eyes are looking. The plan had been perfect until it wasn't. Midnight struck, and the temple bell rang once, then twice, then 3 times. Each chime brought them closer to freedom and closer to being caught. Aurelia, cloaked in rough linen with her hair hidden beneath a servant's scarf, slipped through the outer gate without a word. Rowan was already waiting in the shadows by the supply bodega, face damp with sweat, jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might break. Marisol followed close behind, carrying the small pack that held everything they'd been able to save. The noise from the festival covered them, laughing, shouting, drums pounding like war. The guard were drunk, distracted, loud. For a moment, everything felt possible. They moved fast, through the back alley of the kitchens, past the root cellar, toward the hidden door beneath the old chapel, with a stolen horse waited tethered in the trees. Rowan had counted the steps in his mind 1,000 times. He knew where the floor creaked, knew how to step between the guard sight lines, knew how long each torch stayed lit. But plans don't bleed. People do. They were halfway through the final corridor when the sound hit. A voice, sharp, wrong, sober. Hey, one guard. Then another. Then three. Swords unsheathed in the dark. Rowan grabbed Aurelia's hand and ran. Marisol turned and stepped forward, not away from the guards, but toward them. This way, she screamed, pulling their attention. She ran back the way they came, drawing steel behind her. Rowan didn't see her fall. He didn't hear the blow, but he felt it, like something had been torn from his spine. Aurelia turned back, gasping, no, but he yanked her forward. We can't. She knew. She chose. They burst out of the back exit into the freezing night, lungs burning, boots slamming against mud. The woods swallowed them in seconds. Behind them, the sound of hooves. Shouts. Dogs. Not much time. Rowan lifted Aurelia onto the horse like she weighed nothing, then climbed behind her. The path ahead was black, unmarked, slick with dew. But Rowan didn't hesitate. He drove the horse forward like his life depended on it, because it did. Branches tore at their clothes. Stones sliced their palms when they were forced to dismount and cross the rocky ridge by foot. Twice Aurelia stumbled. Twice Rowan caught her without a word. They moved like two people with nothing left to lose, and everything still worth saving. The river crossing was the worst. Icy water up to their waists, current stronger than it looked. Aurelia screamed when she slipped. Rowan pulled her up by the wrist, dragging her to the other side with a grunt that sounded more animal than man. Behind them, the dogs howled. Closer now, closer than they could afford. They didn't speak. There was no room for speech. Only the pounding rhythm of survival. One foot, then the next. One breath, then another. Every movement was a prayer. Every heartbeat a countdown. The sky began to lighten. The air shifted. And somewhere deep inside both of them, a question pulsed, unspoken but loud. Will we make it? They didn't know. But they ran anyway. They reached the clearing just as the sky began to bruise with dawn. The horse was foaming at the mouth, trembling beneath them, but hadn't slowed. Not once. The trees thinned, and the salty sting of ocean air hit their faces like a final warning. Rowan pulled the reins hard and dismounted first. Aurelia swung her leg over and nearly collapsed, but he caught her again, just like he always did. They had made it through the worst of the forest, but that meant nothing yet. They were still exposed, still hunted, still breathing someone else's air. The port lay beyond the ridge, tucked into a forgotten corner of the coast, known only to smugglers, fishermen, and people who didn't want to be found. A man named Elias waited there, an old friend of Marisol's who had once smuggled royal wine under the noses of tax collectors. He didn't ask why she had sent word. He didn't care. His payment was gold, and his trade was silence. The boat was already rocking gently in the shallows when they arrived, small, weather-worn, barely seaworthy, but floated. And right now, that was enough. Rowan handed Elias the pouch. The old man didn't count the coins. He just looked at Aurelia, clothes torn, hair matted, face pale with exhaustion, and then looked at Rowan. She yours? He asked flatly. Rowan didn't answer. Didn't have to. The man nodded once, and that was the end of it. No names. No blessings. Just a quiet click of fate moving into place. They stepped onto the boat as the first real light broke the horizon. Behind them, the dogs had gone silent. Either they'd lost the trail, or they were close enough that silence meant blood. Rowan untied the rope with shaking fingers. Elias raised the sail. Aurelia sat low on the deck, arms wrapped around her belly, face turned toward the open water. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried since the moment Marisol fell. That grief had hardened into something else now, something sharper. A vow. The wind caught the sail. The boat jerked forward. The shoreline began to fade. Behind them, the kingdom of Eloria screamed in silence, unaware that its queen had vanished in the middle of the night with a child that would rewrite bloodlines. Ahead of them, open sea, unknown land, maybe freedom, maybe something worse. But at least it was theirs to face. Rowan didn't look back. He stood beside her, one hand on the edge of the boat, the other on her shoulder. Neither spoke. There was nothing left to say. They had escaped, but not without cost. Marisol was gone. The king would discover the betrayal within days. And when he did, he would burn everything in his path. But for now, for this moment, they were alive, together. And that, for the first time, was more than just a dream. The journey took 5 days. 5 days of open sea, sleepless nights, and salted wounds that couldn't be seen. The boat rocked with every wave like it, too, wasn't sure where it was going. Aurelia barely spoke. She sat with her knees drawn to her chest, eyes fixed on the horizon, arms wrapped protectively around her belly like it was the only truth left in the world. Rowan kept near her, but not too close. He knew when to stay silent, knew that what she carried was more than a child. It was memory. It was loss. It was guilt that no one could touch. On the morning of the 6th day, the boat pulled into a narrow inlet where the cliffs gave way to earth, and earth gave way to smoke and human noise. It wasn't a city. It wasn't even a town. Just a fishing village with half-rotted docks and brown rooftops sagging with age. But it was land, and it wasn't Valoria. That was enough. A man waited on the dock. Skin like sun-dried leather, eyes like cracked stone, hair thick with salt. He didn't ask who they were. He didn't need to. Elias had sent word ahead, and the message had been clear. 2 passengers, no questions. He offered his hand as they stepped off the boat. "My name's Esteban," he said, voice like gravel. "You can rest here. No one cares who you were." And for the first time, those words didn't sound like rejection. They sounded like mercy. They stayed in Esteban's home that first night, a narrow, one-room shack with patched windows and the smell of fish in every wall. Aurelia slept like someone who hadn't truly rested in years. Rowan didn't sleep at all. He sat by the window, watching the stars, listening for footsteps that would never come. The next morning, Esteban handed them a bundle of old clothes and a choice. "You can keep running," he said, "or you can bury who you were and start again." Aurelia looked at Rowan, then down at her belly. She didn't hesitate. "My name is Anna," she said. The name fell from her lips like it had always been there. Rowan nodded. "And I'm still me." Esteban shrugged. "Good. Then you're just 2 more people trying to live." They found work within the week. Anna taught the children of the village how to read. Slowly, gently, using stories she had heard as a child but never believed were hers to tell. The kids loved her. They didn't know she had once worn a crown, or that she had sat at banquet tables where food was served with golden knives. All they saw was a woman who listened when they spoke. A woman who remembered their names. That was enough. Rowan became a blacksmith. The village hadn't had one in years, and his hands knew the rhythm of the forge like they were born to it. He worked long hours, shirtless in the heat, sparks flying around him like stars he could finally catch. People respected him because he built things, because he didn't talk too much, because he fixed what was broken without asking how it got that way. They told no one their story. There was no need. The village asked no questions. It had seen too many wars, too many refugees, too many people who came with broken pasts and just wanted to forget. And slowly, Anna and Rowan stopped watching over their shoulders. They began to speak louder, laugh longer, walk through the market hand in hand. The fear never fully left. It lived in the quiet, in the corners, in the dreams, but it didn't rule them anymore. At night, they sat outside their little rented room. Anna with her head on Rowan's shoulder, his hand on her growing stomach, both of them breathing in the scent of something they had never truly known before. Peace. The baby moved for the first time on a warm evening in early spring. Anna cried, not out of fear, not even out of joy, but out of release. Because this child was no longer just a secret. It was a future, and it had survived everything that tried to end it. They didn't plan to stay. At first, it was just a place to breathe, a temporary stop between running and whatever came next. But time has a way of reshaping plans, especially when it brings quiet. Weeks turned into months. The air felt lighter. The tension in their shoulders eased. Anna began to smile more without realizing it. Rowan stopped checking the window every night. Life didn't ask who they had been. It only cared who they chose to be now. Anna started with 2 children, then 5, then more. She taught in the shade of the old fig tree behind the fish market, using bits of charcoal and broken slates, telling stories that sounded like fairy tales, but were actually fragments of history wrapped in hope. She taught them the power of words, how to sound out their names with pride, how to write letters to fathers who had gone to sea and might never come back. The children adored her. They called her Teacher Anna and fought for a seat closest to her voice. They didn't know she had once sat beside a king, that she had slept in a bed with silk sheets and guards at her door. They didn't care. They knew her by how she looked at them. Not like they were poor or small or forgotten, but like they mattered. Rowan didn't talk much. He never had, but his work spoke for him. The village hadn't had a proper blacksmith in years. The tools were old. The horses went unshod. The carts fell apart. Rowan changed that. He rebuilt plows. He forged nails and hinges and blades. He repaired what no one else could. His hands had once polished armor for generals who never fought their own battles. Now those same hands built axes for men who woke before the sun and tilled until their fingers bled. The villagers watched him, at first with caution, then with curiosity, and finally with respect. They didn't ask where he learned to shape iron like it was clay. They didn't need to. Their home was small, just one room with a bed they built themselves, a table with uneven legs, and shelves Rowan carved from driftwood. But it was theirs. No gatas, no words, no whispers, just breath, just sleep, just silence that didn't feel like fear. At night, they would sit by the fire. Anna would sew baby clothes with rough thread, Rowan sanding down wooden spoons beside her. They didn't talk much about Valoria. Some things were better left in the dark. But every once in a while, Rowan would reach over, lay his palm on her stomach, and she'd cover it with hers. And in that simple gesture, everything they had lost, everything they had risked, made sense. The pregnancy was different out here. There were no doctors in white robes, no scented cloths, no golden basins. Just midwives with thick hands and deep voices. Women who had delivered more babies than they had fingers to count. They came to check on Anna every few days, brought herbs and advice, and old songs meant to ward off pain. They didn't ask if Rowan was the father. They didn't care. They brought her tea and told her stories. One of them, a woman named Luza, braided Anna's hair every week and whispered, "You're strong. You'll be fine." Anna believed her. Most days, but sometimes at night, the old fear crept back in. The fear that someone, somewhere, still wanted her dead. That the king hadn't stopped looking. That one wrong face in the crowd would undo everything. Rowan never said it out loud, but he felt it too. He kept a knife near the bed. He always checked the back door before they slept. But the fear didn't paralyze them anymore. It just reminded them of the cost and made every new breath feel earned. As her belly grew, so did the village's love for her. Strangers brought bread, cloth, fresh fish. One old man carved a small wooden rattle for the baby. They didn't do it because they knew who she had been. They did it because she had become theirs. And that, more than safety, more than distance, was what truly saved them. For the first time, they weren't running. They were rooted. And the child they waited for would be born not in hiding, but in belonging. The labor started just after sunset. It came on fast, sharp, no warning, no time for ceremony. One moment Anna was stirring lentils over the fire. The next her knees buckled, and she gripped the edge of the table so hard the wood cracked. Rowan caught her before she hit the floor. Her face was pale, but her jaw was set. No panique, no fear, just pain, and the deep, quiet knowing of a woman who had already survived too much to back down now. He didn't yell. He didn't run. He carried her to the bed they'd built together and lit the signal candle in the window. The midwives would come. They had practiced this. They were ready. But nothing prepares you for what it feels like when the child you made is ready to meet the world. Luza arrived first, hands steady, eyes calm, already rolling up her sleeves. Two more women followed with boiling water, cloths, and herbs that filled the room with bitter heat. Rowan was told to wait outside. He refused, not with words. He just stayed, knelt by the head of the bed, holding in his hand like it was the only thing keeping him on this earth. She screamed once, short and low. Then again, louder. Luza wiped her brow and whispered, "You're doing it. He's almost here." Anna didn't speak. She couldn't. She bit her lip until it bled. Her body arched. Rowan whispered something to her, not even knowing what it was. She gripped his hand so hard his fingers went numb. And then, all at once, the room fell silent that a beat passed. Then a cry, piercing, angry, alive. A sound like no other. A sound that split the world in two. Luza held him up, slippery and red and perfect. "It's a boy," she said. "No surprise. No ceremony. Just truth." She laid him on Anna's chest. Rowan couldn't move, couldn't breathe. His knees gave out, and he sank beside them, staring at the small, squirming body between them like it was made of fire and light. Anna kirid quietly. Not out of pain. Not anymore. Out of something else. Something new. Something holy. The child's skin was dark. Not as dark as Rowan's. Not as light as Anna's. Somewhere between. His eyes, when they finally opened, were wide and bright, the color of forest soil in morning sun. His fingers curled tight around Anna's. His chest rose and fell fast, steady. He was here. He was real. He had made it. They named him Elian. The name meant nothing to the village, but it meant everything to them. It was borrowed from an old legend Anna's mother used to whisper before bed, about a boy who survived a burning city and grew up to build one where no one bowed to anyone. It was the name of a future that didn't exist yet. The name of a world they would never see, but their son might. The next morning, the door opened and the village came. Not in a crowd, not loudly, but one by one. A loaf of bread, a pouch of herbs, a tiny blue blanket someone had knitted in secret. They didn't ask where the baby's father was from. They didn't ask why his mother's hands looked too soft to belong to a fisherwoman. They saw the child. They saw the way Anna held him. The way Rowan stood behind her like a mountain that would never move. And they knew, maybe not the whole story, but enough. Luza came last. She sat beside Anna, took Elian in her arms, and smiled down at him with the kind of look only women who've seen both life and death can give. "He'll be strong," she said, "not just in body, in soul." Then she looked up at Anna. "You did good, girl. You brought something new into this place." Anna smiled back, tired but whole. "He brought us something too," she said, "a place to belong." Rowan didn't speak that day. He held his son like he was learning to hold a future, and for the first time in his life, no one told him to put it down. That night, after everyone had gone, the three of them lay in silence, listening to Elian breathe. No crown, no chance, no shadows waiting to drag them back. Just skin against skin, heartbeat against heartbeat. In that room, there was no more hiding, no more running. Just a man, a woman, and the child they had risked everything to bring into a world that had no place for him. Until they made one dot, and for the first time, they weren't afraid to fall asleep. That it had been nearly a year. Elian was crawling now, loud and curious, with a voice that filled the house and a grip like he'd been born ready to hold onto the world. Anna had learned to sleep again, not deeply, but without fear clawing at the edge of her dreams. Rowan still kept the knife under the bed, but some nights he forgot it was there. That was progress. The village had become more than a place. It had become home. But peace, like all fragile things, has a sound when it's about to break. And that sound came in the form of a knock. Not loud, not frantic, just 3 slow, deliberate taps on the wooden door before dawn. Rowan was already awake, shirtless, sweat on his back from the forge the night before. He reached for the blade without thinking and opened the door half an inch, enough to see the face of a man he thought had died with the kingdom they'd left behind. Ramiel. The name didn't come right away. At first, it was just a face, weathered, colder than Rowan remembered, but still carrying the same quiet strength that once commanded legions. His armor was gone. His uniform, too. Just a long coat, dusty boots, a scar across his cheek that hadn't been there before. Rowan didn't move. "You found us," he said flatly. Ramiel gave a nod. Not smug, not regretful, just tired. "It took time," he replied. "But I wasn't looking to take you back." That changed everything and nothing. Anna appeared behind Rowan, Elian bundled against her chest, still asleep. Her eyes locked with Ramiel's. No fear, no welcome, just recognition of the past arriving without permission. "Why are you here?" she asked, voice steady. Ramiel didn't answer right away. He looked at the child, then at her, then stepped back from the doorway and said, "Because I once loved a woman I wasn't allowed to touch. And I didn't fight for her. I let the world swallow her whole. I won't make that mistake again." They let him in. He didn't sit. He didn't ask for food. He reached into his coat and placed a bundle on the table, leather wrapped, tightly tied, heavy with promise and warning. Inside, a map marked in red, a pouch of coins that clinked louder than truth, and a sealed letter bearing the insignia of the Valerian crown. "The king is still searching," Ramiel said. "Not actively, not like before, but his pride won't let him stop. He'll never admit you escaped. But if someone finds you, it won't matter how far you've come." He looked at Elian again. Especially now, Anna stayed quiet. She pressed her lips against the crown of her son's head. Rowan stared at the map. "So what? This is another escape?" he asked. "We leave all this behind." Ramiel shook his head. "No, you go deeper. You disappear, so completely the world forgets you ever existed. There's a place across the riverlands, past the salt mines. No borders, no records. You'll need new names again. This time, don't even keep your faces." He pulled a small pendant from around his neck and placed it in Rowan's hand. "This used to open the southern watch gate in Valoria. Now it's worth more than gold to the right people. Use it." Anna stepped forward then, her voice low. "Why are you doing this for us? You with the king's sword." Ramiel looked at her, and for a moment, the soldier slipped away. What was left was a man haunted by someone only he could still see. "Because I once stood by and watched something beautiful be destroyed. And I think, this time if I help it live, maybe I can live too." He left before sunrise. No bouvier, no videntes. Just a final look at Elian and the quiet echo of something almost like peace. Rowan didn't speak for a long time after. Anna held their son and watched her husband read the map over and over like it might change if he stared hard enough. When he finally looked up, he didn't ask what she wanted. He just said, "We'll go. But not because we're afraid. Because we're choosing life again." And that was the last night they were ever seen in that village. They arrived in San Marino just before the rains with nothing but 2 bags, a toddler on Rowan's hip, and a silence they had learned to live inside. The village was small, 50 families, maybe less, wrapped in trees thick enough to hide it from time. No roads led there, just worn trails that faded into brush, and no one came unless they meant to stay. It wasn't a place where people asked questions, which is why it was perfect. They didn't use false names this time. Not because they trusted anyone, but because no one cared enough to question the truth. Here, Rowan was just a quiet man with strong arms and a scar on his shoulder that no one asked about. He built a forge at the edge of the village, near the river, and by the end of the first month, every farmer in a 5-mile radius was bringing their broken tools to Thay Rowan Thorin. He fixed things. That was enough. Anna, with her soft hands and eyes that always seemed to see more than they should, started teaching again. It wasn't official. Nothing was in San Marino, but the children began showing up under the big tree near the well, clutching bits of parchment and burnt sticks for writing. She never talked down to them. She let them speak first, and they loved her for it. To the villagers, she became Ko-Jau Anna. And soon enough, even the oldest women were coming by to ask if she could teach them how to read the letters their sons sent from distant towns. Elian grew fast. His legs ran before his words did. His laugh echoed across the village before most people knew whose child he was. He had Rowan's eyes and Anna's curiosity. He was too smart, too bold, always asking why and never accepting just because as an answer. People said he had magic in his lungs, the way he made everyone turn when he laughed. No one spoke of kings or crowns. No one noticed the way Anna still locked the door twice at night, or how Rowan always kept a knife in the cupboard, out of sight but never out of reach. They lived like people who had earned their peace one bruise at a time. But stories find their way into places like San Marino, even when you don't tell them. It started with the way they looked at each other, like 2 people who had crossed something no one else could see. Then came the whispers, that Anna's hair used to shine like gold before she cut it, that Rowan spoke with a softness that didn't match the calluses on his hands, that they had come from somewhere far and run from something darker. The village never asked, but they talked, and over time, the talking turned into legend. Children told tales that Anna had once been a queen and Rowan her forbidden knight, that they escaped a burning castle in the middle of the night, carrying a baby who would one day save them all. None of it was spoken in anger. It was reverent, half fairy tale, half prayer. They became myth without ever meaning to. But neither of them corrected the stories. They let them grow, because the truth was heavier, and this version they could live with. Years passed. San Marino stayed the same. Small, simple, safe. The only thing that changed was Elian. He got taller, louder, smarter. He asked more questions. He noticed the way Anna sometimes flinched at certain noises, or the way Rowan always watched the road during harvest festivals. And one day, as they sat outside at dusk, Elian looked up and asked, "What do we used to be?" Anna didn't lie, but she didn't answer fully either. "We used to be different," she said, "but now we're exactly who we chose to become." That was enough. For now. Because in San Marino, the past didn't matter. Only the roots you planted. And the family they built, one choice at a time, was strong enough to hold against anything that might come. Elian grew into everything they hoped he would. Strong without needing to prove it. Gentle in the ways that mattered. He had his father's quiet strength, his mother's fire, and a sense of justice that was his alone. He asked questions no one else dared ask, not to be difficult, but because he believed the truth should never hide. By 17, he was helping villagers settle disputes. By 20, he was walking to the neighboring towns, teaching their children to read, teaching their parents to listen. He never spoke about where he came from. He didn't need to. He carried it in how he stood, in how he refused to bow. People followed him not because he demanded it, but because he didn't. News traveled slowly to San Marino, but when it came like thunder. A young man in the northern provinces, dark-skinned, clear-eyed, speaking to crowds that had never been allowed to raise their voices, was calling for change. Not war, not rebellion, just equality. Freedom that didn't depend on bloodlines. Dignity that didn't ask what name you were born with. He didn't give his family name. When asked, he only said, "I come from love." The rumors followed. Some said he was the son of a noblewoman and a fugitive. Others said he was a child of prophecy. A few swore they saw a scar on his hand that matched one Rowan once had. But Anna and Rowan never confirmed anything. When the letters arrived with stories and signatures, they read them in silence, smiled to themselves, then tucked them away. "He's doing what we couldn't," Rowan once said, looking out past the hills. "Not because we failed, because we gave him the space to begin." They grew old together. The lines on Anna's face deepened not from grief, but from laughter. Rowan's back curved slightly, but his hands never lost their grip. They lived simply as they always had. Teaching, forging, listening, loving. The village around them changed. New faces, new homes, but their story remained. Not written in books, just passed from one voice to another. The story of a woman who once wore a crown, and a man who was never allowed to speak, who built a life from ash and raised a son who believed the world could be better. And when they passed, peacefully, quietly, one not long after the other, there were no grand funerals. Just villagers who stood with candles in their hands and tears in their eyes. And in the center of the crowd, a man in his 30s, head bowed, heart full, whispering goodbye not to a past he never needed to know in full, but to the two people who taught him what love really meant. Because sometimes the greatest kingdoms are not built from stone or gold. They're built in the hearts of those who choose love over fear, freedom over silence. Sometimes the most powerful legacy isn't power at all. It's the courage to protect something gentle. And so their story ends, not in a palace, not on a battlefield, but right where it always belonged. In a village that asked no questions. In a child who became a voice. In a love that broke the rules and built something better in its place. If this story moved you, if you believe love has the power to change everything, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs it. And make sure to subscribe for more stories that remind us what really matters. Because sometimes the biggest kingdoms live not in castles, but in the hearts of those brave enough to love.